Imagine being completely alone in the world's most dangerous jungle, with no food, no shelter, and no hope of rescue. Now imagine having to choose between eating live insects or starving to death. This is exactly what happened to 22-year-old Yossi Ghinsberg when he found himself lost in the Bolivian Amazon for 21 terrifying days. What you're about to hear is a true story so incredible, so filled with impossible decisions and miraculous survival, that it defies all logic. Prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about the human will to survive. In 1981, young Israeli adventurer Yossi Ghinsberg had just completed his military service and was backpacking through South America, searching for the adventure of a lifetime. Like many young travelers, he was drawn to the mystique of the Amazon rainforest. But what started as a dream expedition would soon become his worst nightmare. In La Paz, Bolivia, Yossi encountered a charismatic Austrian geologist named Karl Ruprechter. Karl claimed to be an expert on the Amazon and promised to guide Yossi and two other backpackers, Marcus Stamm from Switzerland and Kevin Gale from America, to a remote indigenous village deep in the jungle where they could find gold and experience authentic tribal life. Karl painted vivid pictures of uncharted territories, hidden treasures, and indigenous communities that had never been contacted by the outside world. For young adventurers hungry for the extraordinary, it sounded like the opportunity of a lifetime. But there were warning signs that the group chose to ignore. Local authorities in La Paz had no record of Karl Ruprechter as a licensed guide. Indigenous communities they spoke with had never heard of the village Karl described. Even experienced jungle guides warned them against venturing into the uncharted regions Karl proposed to take them. But the allure of adventure proved stronger than caution. The group purchased basic supplies, hired a local boat, and began their journey down the Tuichi River into the heart of the Bolivian Amazon. What they didn't know was that Karl Ruprechter was not who he claimed to be, and the jungle they were entering was far more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. After several days navigating treacherous rapids and dense jungle, tensions within the group began to rise. Food supplies were running dangerously low, and Karl seemed increasingly uncertain about their location. The promised indigenous village was nowhere to be found, and it became clear that they were hopelessly lost. Marcus Stamm, the Swiss traveler, had developed severe trench foot and could barely walk. His feet were rotting from constant moisture and infection, filling the air with the stench of decay. The group faced an impossible decision: continue together at Marcus's slow pace and risk everyone's survival, or split up to increase their chances. Against all survival wisdom, they made the fatal choice to separate. Karl and Marcus would attempt to hike back through the jungle to find help, while Yossi and Kevin would continue down the river on a makeshift raft, hoping to reach civilization downstream. The raft they constructed was nothing more than a few logs tied together with rope, barely capable of supporting two men and their remaining supplies. As they pushed off into the churning waters of the Tuichi River, Yossi had no idea he was about to face the greatest challenge of his life. The river quickly became violent and unpredictable. Massive rocks jutted from the water like ancient teeth, and the current grew stronger with each passing mile. Then disaster struck. A powerful rapid caught their fragile raft, spinning it wildly out of control. In the chaos of crashing water and splintering wood, Yossi was thrown from the raft and swept away by the merciless current. When he finally managed to drag himself onto the muddy riverbank, bruised and gasping for air, he looked around desperately for Kevin. But there was nothing. No raft, no friend, no supplies. Just the endless impenetrable wall of green that surrounded him on all sides. 22-year-old Yossi Ghinsberg was now completely alone in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. What do you think about what you've seen so far? Can you imagine making the decision to split up in such a dangerous situation? Let me know your thoughts as we continue this incredible story. The reality of his situation hit Yossi like a physical blow. He was alone in the Amazon rainforest with no map, no compass, no food, and no way to communicate with the outside world. The jungle around him was alive with sounds he couldn't identify, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. His first priority was finding water, But even this basic necessity became a challenge. The river water was murky and potentially contaminated with parasites. But he had no choice but to drink it. Within hours, he was racked with stomach cramps and diarrhea, further weakening his already compromised body. As hunger gnawed at his stomach, Yossi was forced to make choices that would have been unthinkable just days before. He began eating anything he could find. Wild fruits that made him violently ill, bitter roots that burned his mouth, and eventually live insects and larvae that he found under rotting logs. The first time he ate a living grub, Yossi vomited immediately. But as the days passed and his desperation grew, he learned to swallow the writhing creatures quickly, trying not to think about their texture or taste. This wasn't just about overcoming disgust. It was about choosing life over death with every horrifying bite. But the most terrifying moment came on his 6th night alone. Yossi had found a small clearing where he attempted to build a shelter from palm fronds and branches. Around midnight, he was awakened by a sound that froze his blood, the deep rumbling growl of a jaguar. Through the moonlight filtering through the canopy, he could see the silhouette of the massive cat just 20 feet away. Its eyes reflected the pale light like 2 golden coins. And Yossi could hear its heavy breathing as it studied this strange intruder in its territory. For what felt like hours, Yossi remained perfectly still, knowing that any movement could trigger an attack. The jaguar circled his makeshift shelter, occasionally letting out low growls that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Finally, as dawn approached, the great cat melted back into the jungle, leaving Yossi shaking uncontrollably and more aware than ever of how precarious his situation had become. Thank you so much for staying with us this far into this incredible story. What you've heard is just the beginning, and I promise you, the most unbelievable parts are still to come. By the second week, Yossi's mind began to fracture under the relentless pressure of survival. Malnutrition, dehydration, and constant stress had pushed his brain to its breaking point, and he began experiencing vivid hallucinations that were often more real to him than his actual surroundings. He would have entire conversations with his family back in Israel, hearing their voices so clearly that he would call out responses, only to be answered by the mocking calls of howler monkeys high in the canopy. He saw rescue helicopters that turned out to be large birds, and imagined elaborate meals that dissolved into handfuls of bitter leaves when he tried to eat them. But perhaps the most horrifying moment came on day 15, when Yossi discovered that his left foot had become severely infected. Days of walking through mud, water, and debris had created deep gashes that were now black with gangrene. The smell of rotting flesh attracted clouds of flies, and he could see maggots beginning to infest the wounds. Faced with the terrifying prospect of blood poisoning that would certainly kill him, Yossi made an unthinkable decision. Using a small pocket knife, dulled by days of use, he began to cut away the infected flesh from his own foot. Without anesthesia, without sterile conditions, and with nothing but his own determination to live, he performed surgery on himself in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. The pain was beyond description. Each cut sent lightning bolts of agony through his entire body, but he forced himself to continue, knowing that this gruesome self-mutilation was his only chance of survival. Blood poured from the wounds as he carved away the putrid tissue, and several times he nearly passed out from the intensity of the pain. When he was finished, his foot looked like raw hamburger, but the worst of the infection had been removed. He packed the wound with crushed leaves and wrapped it with strips torn from his shirt, creating a crude bandage that would have to suffice. As he lay in his shelter that night, fevered and delirious from pain and infection, Yossi began to consider the unthinkable. Maybe it would be easier to just give up. Maybe death would be a mercy compared to this endless suffering. For the first time since becoming lost, he seriously contemplated just lying down and letting the jungle take him. But somewhere deep inside, a stubborn spark of life refused to be extinguished. Tomorrow, he promised himself, just survive one more day. On the morning of day 21, Yossi Ghinsberg was barely recognizable as human. He had lost over 40 pounds. His body was covered in infected cuts and insect bites, and his self-amputated foot was a constant source of agony. But fate, it seemed, had one more card to play. Meanwhile, unknown to Yossi, his friend Kevin had survived the raft accident, and made it to a small settlement downstream. Despite being told by local authorities that searching for Yossi would be impossible in such vast and dangerous territory, Kevin refused to give up on his friend. He convinced a local pilot named Carlos to help him search the jungle from the air. Even though the chances of finding anyone alive after 3 weeks were virtually zero. As their small plane flew over the endless canopy of green, Kevin scanned desperately for any sign of his lost friend. The jungle stretched in all directions like a living carpet, broken only occasionally by rivers that snaked through the landscape like silver threads. Just as they were about to turn back, their fuel running dangerously low, Kevin spotted something impossible. A small clearing with what looked like a human figure waving frantically at the aircraft. Carlos brought the plane lower, and through his binoculars, Kevin could see the skeletal, bearded figure of Yossi Ghinsberg, barely alive but somehow still fighting. The rescue itself was a miracle of determination and luck. Carlos managed to land the small plane on a narrow riverbank nearly a mile away from where Yossi was stranded. Kevin and a local guide had to hack through dense jungle for hours to reach the clearing where Yossi lay collapsed, barely conscious and mumbling incoherently. When Kevin finally reached his friend, he barely recognized him. Yossi's eyes had sunk deep into his skull. His beard was matted with mud and blood, and his clothes hung in tatters on his emaciated frame. But he was alive, and that was all that mattered. The journey back to the plane was agonizing. Kevin and the guide had to carry Yossi through the same hostile jungle that had nearly killed him, racing against time as his condition continued to deteriorate. Several times they thought they had lost him, but somehow Yossi's battered body clung to life. When they finally reached medical care in a small Bolivian town, doctors were amazed that Yossi had survived at all. His recovery would take months, and he would carry physical and emotional scars from his ordeal for the rest of his life. The story of Yossi Ghinsberg's survival became legendary, inspiring books, documentaries, and eventually major Hollywood films starring Daniel Radcliffe. But beyond the fame and recognition lies a profound question about the limits of human endurance and the will to survive. What drove a young man to eat live insects, perform surgery on himself with a dull knife, and continue fighting for life even when death seemed like mercy? Perhaps it was love for his family. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness. Or perhaps it was something deeper that we all carry within us, but hope never to need. Karl Ruprechter, the mysterious guide who started this whole nightmare, was never seen again. Some believe he perished in the jungle, while others suspect he was never who he claimed to be in the first place. Marcus Stamm, the Swiss traveler who had separated from the group, was also never found, despite extensive search efforts. Today, Yossi Ghinsberg is a successful author, businessman, and motivational speaker. He has returned to the Amazon many times, not as a lost victim, but as an advocate for indigenous rights and rainforest conservation. His experience taught him that the jungle is not just a place of danger, but also a sacred ecosystem that deserves our respect and protection. What do you think was the most incredible part of Yossi's survival story? Could you have made the same impossible choices he made to stay alive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will challenge everything you think you know about human courage and determination. And don't miss our next recommended video about another impossible survival story that will leave you speechless. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey.